this life we have our sorrows, disappointments and despair. When it seems that we would crumble underneath the load of care, but a brighter day is coming that will make it all worthwhile. When we enter heaven's portals and we see our Savior smile, I can't wait to get to heaven where we'll live forevermore, where we'll see our friends and loved ones who are waiting on that shore. We will sing redemption stories, cast our crowns at Jesus' feet. I can't wait to get to heaven. I can't wait. I can't wait. He's building us a mansion over on the other side. He'll come back someday to claim us. He's the bridegroom and we're the bride. He will drive away all sorrow, wipe the tears from every eye, and we'll live with him forever in that heavenly home on high. I can't wait to get to heaven where we'll live forevermore, where we'll see our friends and our loved ones who are waiting on that shore. We will sing redemption stories, cast our crowns at Jesus' feet. I can't wait to get to heaven. I can't wait. I can't wait. Oh, I can't wait to get to heaven where we'll live forevermore, where we'll see our friends and loved ones who are waiting on that shore. We will sing redemption stories, cast our crowns at Jesus' feet. I can't wait to get to heaven. No, I can't wait to get to heaven. I can't wait to get to heaven. I can't wait.
Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to begin reading in verse number 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels unto the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel unto favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. We're going to stop there in verse number 9. I want you to leave your Bibles open, and we're going to share some things with you out of these verses tonight. I realize that probably Daniel, because he was a young man, some 17 years old, when they were carried off into captivity into Babylon, that the experiences in Daniel's life, especially these in chapter 1, he being a young man, probably every preacher and many youth pastors and ministers have preached on Daniel many times. And it's not my desire tonight just because Daniel was a young man to preach another sermon about Daniel and the way that he stood for God. But there is a tremendous amount of truth interwoven in this story tonight about Daniel that I feel can be a help to us, and I trust that God will use it tonight to do just that. Our text verse tonight is in verse number 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. But Daniel purposed in his heart. I want to preach tonight on Daniel's decision. I want us to center our thoughts around Daniel's decision. I thought this morning as we had these young people standing all the way across the front of this church that were graduating from high school, some from college, I thought this morning that much of their lives' decisions are going to be made about now. The decisions that many of them make that is going to affect them for the rest of their lives is going to be made in the very near future. And it's been said that the decisions you make today determines what you're going to be tomorrow. And there's a lot of truth in that. Daniel made a decision. He purposed in his heart that he was going to serve God. He purposed in his heart, though he was in a strange land, that he was going to put God first in his life, and that he was not going to defile himself with the king's meat and with the king's drink. I want us to look tonight. I think that in this situation that we see Daniel in, as Daniel made this decision, we're going to see some things that all of us are faced with from time to time. I want us to look first of all tonight at the circumstances in which Daniel made his decision. You've heard me preach over and over about circumstances and what a thief and a robber that we allow circumstances to be in our life. Many times we allow the circumstances to govern our lives, and we allow the circumstances to make our decisions for us. We allow circumstances many times to decide many important things in our life. But aren't you glad tonight that though Daniel was in the midst of ill-favored circumstances, that he refused to let the circumstances that he was in dictate to his life and dictate to him whether or not he was going to be faithful and true to God. Now, I want to tell you something. If you make the right decisions, you're going to make the right decisions in spite of the circumstances that you find yourself in. And if there's anything you ought to purpose tonight, if you don't get anything else out of this message, whether you be young or whether you be middle-aged or whether you be elderly tonight, you ought not to ever give in and allow the circumstances of life to dictate to you and make your decisions. That ought not to be the determining factor in your life. Now, we would not have the story that we have before us tonight if Daniel had been such a young man, to allow the circumstances to dictate to his life. Now, as we look at the circumstances in which Daniel found himself in, he was faced with a threefold crisis that just about every young person in this building tonight is faced with. What was the crisis that Daniel was in as he faced this decision, the purpose in his heart that he was going to stay true to God? Well, look with me first of all into verse number 4. He was facing a conformity crisis. Verse number 4, the king said, in speaking to his the master of his eunuchs, he said, pick out children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now here they were in Babylon. They were in a strange land. They were in the place of Babylon in captivity. And the king said, I want you to pick out the choice children and the choice young people whom we might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Daniel's decision was made in the face of a conformity crisis. He was being pressured to conform to the ways of Babylon. Do you know tonight the kind of pressure and crises that our young people live in, that they're constantly being confronted with a temptation to conform to the ways of this world? Now notice what he said in the latter part of verse 4. He said, whom we might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. You know what the devil wants to do? The devil wants to take our young people and he wants to teach them how to conform to the lifestyle of this world. Whom we may teach the learning of the Chaldeans. And not only the lifestyle of this world, but the language of this world. We want to teach them how to live and how to talk like this world. Now you notice something else that stands out to me in verse number 4. Notice who he said to get. He said, I want you to get children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and so forth. He said, I want you to pick out the best. I want you to pick out those that in whom is no blemish. I want you to pick out those that are well favored. Pick out, in other words, the most popular, the most likely. And pick out those that have the most skill and the most talent and the most ability. And let's target them and let's bring them in and let's teach them the lifestyle and language of the Chaldeans. You know what I'm seeing in our day, and especially in the last few years? I'm seeing the devil make his target those in whom is no blemish, those that are well favored. In other words, the most likely to turn out right, those are the ones that he is choosing to see to it if he can get them to turn out like the world. I'm talking about preachers' kids. I'm talking about deacons' kids. I'm talking about the children of godly parents
that have tried to teach them right and have tried to keep them pure and unblemished from this world, those are the ones seemingly the devil has targeted to see if he can conform them to the ways of this world. In other words, the cream of the crop. You know what I believe tonight? You can call me prejudiced if you want to. And you can say that I'm a little slanted. That's all right. But I believe that we right here at Floyd Road Baptist Church, we have some of the choicest young people, and if you please, the cream of the crop. And we have some that the devil has made his target and zeroed in on their lives because they seemingly have tried to be pure, and seemingly they're well favored, and seemingly they have skill and talent and ability that they could amount to something and be used of God in a mighty way. Seemingly those are the ones the devil has targeted to conform to the ways of this world. When the devil sees, listen, Brother Junior was talking about the potential in these young people this morning. And don't you think if we see the potential that's in them, if we see the potential, if we see the talent and the ability, and we see the purity of their life and how that they have the potential to become something for God, don't you think the devil don't see the same thing we do? And those are the very ones seemingly the devil has targeted to try to lure them away from godly teaching and try to teach them the lifestyle and the language of this world. Daniel made his decision facing such a crisis that he was being tempted to conform to this world. But Daniel had enough grace of God and backbone that he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. My message to the young people tonight is this: I know the crises that you're in to conform to the ways of this world, but do you have what it takes to stand up in the face of this crisis that we're in tonight and say, by the grace of God, I'm going to purpose in my heart that I'm going to put God first and amount to something for Jesus? Or am I going to give in and be conformed to the ways of this world? Secondly, he made this decision facing not only in the face of a conformity crisis, but also in the face of a morality crisis. Look in verse number 5. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. What he wanted to do, he wanted to create an appetite in them for the king's meat and for the king's drink. And you say, preacher, well, why is this such a morality crisis? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the king's meat and the king's drink was eaten and drank in honor to the god of Babylon. Male Meredith. His meat and drink was in honor to the god of Babylon. And for these young people to conform and give in to a diet of the king's meat and drink meant that they had to violate and go against the clear teachings of the Word of God they had been taught before they were brought into captivity. I say tonight that our young people are facing a morality crisis. The devil wants to create in them an appetite for the food on the devil's table. He wants to give them an appetite for the things of this world. Brother Junior was talking about this morning. I want to tell you, this land in which we live in tonight is in a morality crisis. I don't know if you know it or not. Now, I love America. I believe it's the greatest land on this earth, as far as I'm concerned. I'm a red-blooded American. Make no apology for that. But I want to tell you, we got some problems in this country as far as morality is concerned. And I want to tell you, it's not, we keep hearing them talk about, that we don't want this morality issue to get over into politics, and we don't want the government to dictate to us our morality. I want to tell you something. Most of the world tonight don't want to hear preachers preach about it either. It's no more popular for preachers than it is the politicians. I tell you how sick we are in this country. I read the other day where, would you agree with me that our TVs, and most of the programs on TV is filled with sex, illicit sex? You know what I read the other day? Now, if you can fathom this, if you watch TV any amount at all, and the average young person watches 6 hours of TV a day. I read that the other day. And if our young people watches an average of 6 hours TV a day, and of all the programming on TV, of all of the sex, the illicit sex, and all that's on the television, do you know how much, you know what the percentage of all of the sex that we see portrayed on TV, do you know what the percentage is of that we see on TV that is legitimately portrayed between two legitimately married partners? Of all of it that's on there, you know how much of it is portrayed between legitimately married partners? 3%. 3%. Now, if our TVs is filled with it, what does that leave? Is it any wonder that our country's in a morality crisis? Is it any wonder that our young people are being confronted with this morality crisis, and they're being pressured on every hand to give in and to get an appetite for the things of this world? Is it any wonder? Daniel, in the midst of a morality crisis, when the king wanted to create in them an appetite for the things of this world, he had enough grace of God that he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. He wouldn't give in. Then there's a third aspect to the crises that Daniel was in as he made this decision, and that is an identity crisis. Look down in verse number 6. Now among these were all the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Look in verse 7. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. Now this is not without significance. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. You know what the king set out to do? He set out to change the identity of these young people. You see, in the Bible days, when a child was born, they didn't just, grab a name off the top of their head and say, we're going to call him thus and so. But there was always a spiritual significance to the names of children in the Bible. In every one of these, Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, every one of them, their names had a spiritual significance to it. For example, Daniel's name means God is my judge. Hananiah's name means Jehovah is gracious. Mishael's name means who can compare to God. Azariah means the Lord is help. This was their identity given to them by godly parents. This was their heritage. This was their identity. And the devil wanted to erase that identity and give them a new identity. You know what the devil is doing in our day? He is trying to erase the identity that has been given to our children from godly parents and give them a new identity that will fit in this world. I'm wondering, I'm not being a judge, I'm just wondering that when we read this, how they brought these children in. I know they were in captivity, but when they brought these children in who had godly names and changed their names and give them names that were associated to the god of Babylon, and I mean that was totally against their raising and their heritage, I wonder why we don't hear something from the parents of these children about this time. I said this is going to be a message to young people. But let me stray off right here. If we know that the devil is doing everything in his power to erase the heritage and the identity that we've given our children from godly principles and godly teaching, when are we going to stand up and be heard as parents? Or are we just going to sit back and let them get away with it? You want me to tell you the philosophy? Now listen, don't get mad at me tonight. We have people in this church that are school teachers. But for the most part, the educational system in this country is humanistic. And they are teaching and pumping the humanistic philosophy and the New Age philosophy and all of that into our children. And I'm going to tell you what the bottom line to all of that is to take away from them the heritage and the identity that you and I have tried to give them. They want to change that identity. As far as I'm concerned, and you can say what you will, but when they took prayer and Bible out of the schools, it started on its way to hell right then. And it's gaining speed every year that goes by. They wanted to change the identity. Get some of the books. They tell me that for the most part in American history books that they have deleted and tried to remove any acknowledgement of God from our founding fathers that come to this country. That they've done their best to delete all of it as much as they possibly can and still get away with it out of any kind of reference to God or religion. But I want to tell you, this country is what it is tonight because it was built on God-fearing people that loved God, believed in God, and believed the Bible. They wanted to change their identity. They were in a conformity crisis. Let's make them like the world. They were in a morality crisis. Let's give them a diet off the king's table in Babylon. And they were in an identity crisis. Let's take away the names and the identity and the heritage given to them by godly parents, and let's make them heathenistic after the gods of Babylon. That's the kind of circumstances Daniel was in when he made his decision. Now, if you think it was easy, it was not. And if you think it's easy for our young people today facing the crises that they're in, constantly being pressured and pulled by this world to become like the world, constantly being tempted to have an appetite for the things of this world, constantly trying to lose their identity, if you think it's easy, it's not. But I want to tell you, it's still possible to stand up and count for God and Jesus in this day. It's still possible, young people. Dare to be a Daniel? Do you have what it takes to be a Daniel? I mean, when everything about the system and everything about society is trying to get you to conform to the morality and the ways of this world and to lose your identity. Well, I want to tell you something. I was preaching a revival up here the other week, and I said, you know, I remember when I was growing up as a young man, I haven't always been proud of my identity. I remember when I was a young man going to church, and I've never known anything but an old-fashioned Baptist preacher for a daddy. I've never known anything but old-fashioned shouting mother.
that love God. Now, I remember going to church when I was a young man, a teenager, and I'd take my girlfriend to church. And I remember praying under my breath, Lord, don't let my mama get happy today and embarrass me. And Lord, don't let my daddy get happy today and preach all over the church, and embarrass me. I wasn't always proud of that. I wanted him to kind of be refined, along about them times when I was going through them prideful years and all that. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. God never answered one of my prayers. Just as sure as I went in church with an attitude like that, my mother would pitch one of the awfulest fits you ever seen and shout for 20 minutes. My daddy'd preach up and down both aisles, spit on the first 5 rows, and have a time. But you know what? You know what? The older I get and the further down the road I get, the more proud that I am of the identity and the heritage that I have of an old-fashioned, God-fearing, God-loving, sin-hating, heaven-sweet preaching daddy that I have. I'm proud of him tonight. An old-fashioned shouting, I wish she was here tonight. I'd pray for God to let her shout. Amen. I'd pray for God to let her get happy. I'm proud of my heritage. I don't want to lose my identity. And I imagine some of you young people, when y'all come in sometimes, you pray for, Lord, don't let old Brother Burman get out of the crisis today. Let him act right. Young people, don't ever be ashamed of your identity. Don't ever be ashamed of your godly heritage. Don't ever be ashamed of a godly mother and a godly father that it tries to teach you right. The day will come, and you may not even agree with what I'm preaching right now, but you just remember right here on the 31st day of May, 1992, 20 years from now, you'll agree with what I'm preaching. Whether you do tonight or not, 20 years from now, you'll agree with it. Daniel was in the midst of circumstances. He was faced with a threefold crisis: conformity to the world, morality crises, identity crises. But he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. Let's look at a second thing. What about the characteristics of Daniel's decision? Not only the circumstances in which he made his decision, but what about the characteristics of Daniel's decision? First of all, look back in verse 8 with me, and I want to say that it was an individual decision. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. Do you know that Daniel said, I don't know how everybody else feels, and I don't even care how anybody else feels, but I've purposed in my heart. I've purposed in my heart that I'm not going to go this route. I've purposed in my heart I'm going to be different. If I'm the only one, I'm not going to go the ways of Babylon. I'm not going to drink the drink of the king and eat the king's meat. I'm not going to conform and sell out to the ways of Babylon. He said, I'm going to do it if I'm the only one. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. Well, what about it tonight, young people, if you're the only one? Do you love God enough? Daniel was a 17-year-old boy, but he loved God enough. He said, but Daniel. It was an individual decision. He was under pressure from the culture of that land. He was a long way from home in a strange land in Babylon. The culture of that land was different. I want to tell you, we're strangers in this world. This world is not our home. And the culture of our land has got our young people under pressure to give in. But God give us some Daniels that if they be the only one, they'll decide and purpose in their heart they're not going to defile themselves. I imagine Daniel was under pressure from his peers, his comrades and his peers. And I imagine some of them said, well, Daniel, there's no need to make a scene. I mean, we're a long way from home. We're over here in Babylon, and we're a long way from our home, and nobody knows us. And it's not really going to hurt anything if we just eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. It's not going to really hurt that much, and it's not going to make that much difference. Why make a scene, and why stick out like a sore thumb? Why don't we just go along with the crowd? I imagine Daniel was under some amount of peer pressure, but he still purposed in his heart. Young people, you don't have to go with the crowd. You don't have to give in and be like the crowd. You know, the pressure now is, well, go along. Everybody else is doing it. I mean, this is the end thing. And just go along. I mean, no need to be an oddball. Everybody will look at you and make fun of you. And just go along with the crowd. I mean, everybody's doing it. I read a story one time where this young girl, and I tell you, the premarital sex, I guess that's a pleasant way. The Bible calls it fornication. And by the way, it's still sin. But I read a story one time where there was a young girl, and she, like Daniel, had purposed in her heart she was going to keep herself pure for the man she married. At whatever price, she was going to retain her virginity. And I read where one of the other girls all said, come on, you don't know what you're missing. Everybody else is doing it. And I mean, it's the end thing now. And she started sharing her experience and said, the girl looked at her and said, listen, said, anytime I choose, I can become like you are, but you can never again be like I am. And I thought there's a lot of truth in that. Some things you can't take back. And the devil knows that. And I would to God we could get that message through to young people. There's just some things you can't take back. Some things you can't undo as easy as you do them. If that's the pressure that young people are under today, oh, everybody's doing it. That's, you know, it's cool. It's the end thing. If I had all night tonight, I could stand here and recite to you one heartbreaking story after another of those who just wanted to go along with the crowd. And do it because it's the end thing to do. I believe it was the other Sunday I stated the statistics that I'd read. Of all the alcoholics in this country, that over 90% of them took their first drink when they were a teenager. Can you imagine that? And I read this statistic, and this was startling. That 9 out of 10 young people that smoke their first cigarette go on to become addicted. Do you know that young people's lives tonight are not fun and games? It is not a passing fad. And Brother Junior made a statement this morning when these young people are standing up here, wonder where they'll be and what they'll be doing 20 years from now. The Lord don't come. Wonder where they'll be. I'll tell you where they'll be if the devil has his way. They'll be drug addicts. They'll be alcoholics. They'll be married 3 or 4 times. Huh? Their lives will be wrecked and ruined and left in shambles. If the devil has his way, that's the way they'll end up. But I pray to God, out of that row of young people that was up here this morning, there's going to be some Daniels come out of that group. that is going to say, I purposed in my heart that my life's going to count for God. Daniel, I'm sure, when he made that individual decision, was under pressure. But notice something else about Daniel's, the characteristics of his decision. It not only was an individual decision, but it was an influential decision. Look in verse 8. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart. But look in verse 10 now. Now God had brought Daniel, or in verse 10, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces? Plural. Daniel's the one that purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. But he already had 3 more that had joined him, and I believe who were influenced by his decision, that said if Daniel is going to dare to stand up and be counted for God in this strange land in which we're living in, then we'll just go with Daniel. And the next thing you know, we start out, but Daniel, and then by the time you get to verse 10, there's 3 more. They had joined Daniel. Do you know tonight, young people, you never know the influence that you have. And listen, I hear this over and over and over again, that Johnny is a good boy or Susie is a good girl. Their only problem is they just got in with the wrong crowd. Why does it have to be that way? Why is it that we let 1 or 2 rebels tear down those that are trying to live for God and want to amount to something for God, come under their influence and get led astray? Why don't we have some Daniels that'll stand up and influence young people to God instead of the devil? By the grace of God, young people, you don't have to be influenced by your peers and by your comrades. They look at you and call you a square, and they call you a holy Joe and a holier than thou, and they look down at you because you won't go along with the crowd. Why don't you look at them the same way they look at you? And when it's all been said and done and the last chapter has been written, find out who the fool is. Like Paul said, somebody said, quoted the scripture, Paul said, I'm a fool for Christ's sake. Whose fool are you? I'd rather be Christ's fool than the devil's fool. But if Daniel made an influential decision, the next thing you know, he looked around and he had 3 more standing with him. Young people, you never know. When you take a stand for God in school, you think you're the only one there. You may look around someday and there may be another 1 or 2 there that was just waiting on somebody to give them a little nudge. That was waiting on somebody to have enough courage and that'll stand with you. He made an influential decision. Then there's a third characteristic about his decision. He made an intelligent decision. The reason I say that he made an intelligent decision is based on 2 words that characterize his decision. Look in verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he will not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat nor with the wine which he drank. Now notice this. Therefore he requested of the prince of eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now that's kind of strange, I know, for a Bible believer to request. That's the reason I say it was an intelligent decision. Do you know sometimes you don't have to have a PhD to be intelligent. You just have to have a little common sense. He requested. How far do you think he would have got if he'd have jumped up and said, bless God, I'll tell you right now, I'm not about to participate in this. And he would have come across as arrogant and self-righteous as some Baptists I know. Huh? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, listen, I cringe sometimes at how the cause of Christ is shamed and degraded by people who don't make intelligent decisions and who don't use common sense. Do you know that as much as you love God and as much as you want to stand for God, if you're not careful, the devil can take that and he can use it to be more of a detriment than anything else? And if you've noticed and if you've looked, do you know where, and listen, the news media, some of this liberal news media and all, have made Christians look like a bunch of idiots. Huh? They have made us look like a bunch of fools and a bunch of idiots. And much of that is because we haven't used common sense. Everything's not accomplished by rolling your sleeves up. I've told you before, I tell you why I stay off a lot of issues. I know what my temperament is. I'm a fighter. I know what my temperament is. I know how easy it is for me to go off the deep end of something. I know how easy it is for me to get out of balance. I know how easy it'd be for me to roll my sleeves up and start foaming at the mouth over some of these issues. You see, I know me. I know what this flesh is made out of. I know my temperament, and I know what I'm made out of. But after 25 years of preaching and pastoring, if I've learned anything, it pays sometimes just to stay sensitive to the Holy Spirit and use a little common sense in some of these things. I get tickled at Brother Junior sometimes, and I see myself in him. I see Brother Junior sometimes his eyes will flare up, you know, and over some of these things that come about, his eyes will flare up, and I can see me in him about 20 years ago. Now listen, I'm not talking about forsaking what's right. I'm not talking about compromising. I'm just talking about allowing God to mold you and make you. And I tell Brother Junior, you know, and I feel like I've got a responsibility to him as his pastor. But I see some of these issues that have been handled in the wrong way, that it's done more harm. And Daniel, as I said, he's going to come up from there rip snorting, but I want to tell you, he got the job done, and what he said was that he requested. Now, you can say what you want to about the way Daniel handled this. I just think he handled it like a Christian. I think he handled it godlike. The Bible said, therefore he requested of the prince of eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And he come on down, make a long story short, and I'm going to bring the message to a close in just a moment. But to come on down and make a long story short, he suggested that they be given a chance to prove their God. He said, all I request is that, and then he suggested, give us a test. Let us prove our God. And we'll go on a vegetation diet, and you let the rest of them eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine, and we'll just eat vegetation and water, and we'll see. Let's put God to the test and give God a chance to be God. And that's what happened. And that brings me to the last thing that I want to bring about. Let me read verse 15, then I'm going to move to the consequences of Daniel's decision. We'll be through. Verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, their countenance appeared fair and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Did you know that sooner or later, whom you choose to follow is going to show up on your countenance? When they looked at them, their countenance fared better than all the rest of them that had eaten the king's meat and drank the king's wine. They put God to the test. Why don't we let God be God and realize the battle is the Lord's? Boy, I've had to be taught that over and over a lot of times when I want to take things in my hands. But the battle is the Lord's. And Daniel said, let's give God a chance. He requested and suggested that they be given a chance for God to prove himself in their life. And it worked. All right, right quick. Let's look at the consequences. Look down at verse 17. The consequences of Daniel's decision. I like this. Verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now to end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Therefore stood they before the king. You go back up to verse 17 where I started at. As for these children, God gave them knowledge and skill and learning and wisdom. I want to tell you, the world thinks we're a bunch of dummies. I think it's time that God has some representation on the honor rolls in some of these schools and colleges around here of young people that have purposed in their heart that they're not going to defile themselves with the king's meat and the king's drink, but they've took a stand for God and stayed true to the Lord. And God has given them knowledge. And God has given them learning and wisdom and skill and so forth. We don't have to be illiterates, and we don't have to be dummies to be a Christian and to love God and stand for Jesus. That's the picture the world's painted of us, but that don't have to be so. God can honor us. If we honor Him, He'll honor us. Look down in verse 19. I like this. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Have you noticed something different here? They've got their identity back. They didn't call them the names that they had been given in verse 7. When the king communed with them, he was calling them Daniel. And he was calling them, huh? Y'all just sit there. I'll shout about this myself. What I'm saying, the bottom line is, when you stay true to God, the devil's going to realize he can't take your heritage and your identity away from you. He'll call you what you're supposed to be called. Amen? You know what we need in this day and hour in which we live? We need to be called Christians again. And the devil's changed our identities and changed our... And nobody calls us what we're supposed to be called. We're called dummies and everything else nowadays. But I want to tell you, when you put God to the test and He proves who He is, and you stay true to God, we'll have the respect enough from the world that they'll call us by the right name again. Daniel put his God to the test, and God honored that. And the king said, "Why, there's none like them. There's none like them." You see, God honored them with education. He gave them knowledge and skill and wisdom. God honored them with examination. When they went in and stood before the king, they passed the test and retained their proper identity. Down in verse 21, the Bible said, and Daniel continued. Daniel continued. He went on. The Bible said Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. I pray that some of the young people we have, even in this place tonight, will continue with the Lord. The character not to be a quitter is molded in our youth, folks. The character to put our shoulder to the plow and not look back is molded in the days of our youth. I'm more convinced of that every day. The character that's being molded in the lives of these young people, I pray, is to continue with the Lord. These young people are not just the church of tomorrow, they're the church of today. 20 years from now, If we've got some Daniels in this group right over here, and some that are scattered out in other spots in this church tonight, 20 years from now, who knows? One of them may be the pastor and preach in this place. Who knows how many of them will sit on the deacon board in this church? Who knows how many of them will be teaching Sunday school classes in this church? Who knows what God has in store for their life? It's going to start by making the right decision. But Daniel purposed in his heart. While every head's bowed,